BBC, leading the way to the greatest show on earth. In 1982, Robert Lawrence went to war.
The assault on Mowlam is confirmed. What's he going to do, Daddy? I don't know, Spike. He wants to be a soldier. You know that.
Nobody knows what to say, what to do. Nobody knows how to treat us. Nobody.
Colin Firth stars in the award-winning Tumbledown on Monday at 10:10 on BBC1.
Now on BBC1, Peter Sissons introduces Question Time.
Question Time, which tonight returns to the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre at the heart of Westminster, where this week a form of early summer calm was abruptly shattered by the shockwaves of the Danish referendum. Around the table, the Right Honourable Virginia Bottomley, the Secretary of State for Health, the job she always wanted after her many years as a social worker among children. In 13 years of Tory government, one of only 3 women appointed to the cabinet, and 2 of those, her included, within only the last 8 weeks. Mrs. Bottomley has vowed to take the politics out of the National Health Service, and despite some chauvinist comparisons to Mary Poppins, the rotters, The Guardian wrote that she was more like Nurse Matilda, the lady that was sent for when the children became intolerable. Dr. Marjorie Mowlam is a Labour frontbencher with responsibility for city and corporate affairs, a former academic with a pedigree, according to the Financial Times, with plenty in it to alarm the average merchant banker. Before the election, she played a major role in Labour's so-called prawn cocktail offensive in the city, with some impressive feedback, if that's the word. The FT described her as a familiar and courted figure in the square mile, a freshly minted, late 1980s Kinnockite, and hungry for power. Dr. Marie Stewart runs an equal opportunities consultancy, which she founded 2 years ago. She came to the UK from Jamaica when she was 18 and has been back to do research into the psychological effects of malnutrition on children. She's recently worked on equal opportunities guidelines for the civil service and is currently helping the Bar Council to implement their new race equality policy. Described by associates as tough, no-nonsense and dynamic, the Bar Council adds that she has this charm which seems to convince everybody immediately that she is right. Dr. Sheila Lawlor is the Radical Deputy Director of Studies at the right-wing Centre for Policy Studies, a former Cambridge historian. She joined the Centre 5 years ago after working on Conservative education policies at Central Office. The former Director of the CPS, David Willets, now an MP, describes her as a formidable expert on education who's left her mark on government policy. Teachers have criticised her for living in a bygone age that never existed. But the Times educational supplement observed reverently, Dr. Lawlor speaks in floods of conviction. 3 doctors of philosophy and 1 Secretary of State shouldn't be short of a few answers. So let's have the first question, which comes from Ramnik Shah, who's a solicitor. Sir.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question is the result of the Danish referendum on the Maastricht Treaty a blessing in disguise for Britain?
Mowlam.
I don't think it's a blessing in disguise for John Major, because with the problems he's got on his backbenches and the problems he'll have in his presidency, I think it's far from a blessing in disguise. It's probably a nightmare for him. And I don't think it is, in a sense, for us as a country. We will still continue to push for we are supportive of parts of Maastricht Agreement, but we want to see other things in there. We want to see greater democratic accountability, greater decentralisation, stronger regional policy. So the things that we think are important, we will still continue to press for. So I don't think, in a sense, it's caused confusion rather than anything else.
Where do you stand on the subject of a possible British referendum? Brian Gould doesn't seem to have ruled it out. John Smith does. What's your view?
My view on a referendum is that I think if 11 out of the other 12 countries were having one, then we would be the odd person out and it would be illogical. But I don't actually see a need for a referendum. We had one in 1975 to go in. We're in. We might as well get it on at being in and negotiate. The arguments have been put frequently that we have a parliamentary democracy. The point of sending us to Westminster is to make decisions often that don't fit into a yes-no category, because sometimes it's yes but or maybe no, but only if this is, you know, B and C happens. So I think referendum do have that limitation, and as we've seen in referenda in other countries, money talks. And when we actually get the breakdown of what the Danes were saying when they said no, because none of us really know, some wanted stronger Europe, some wanted less. There was a whole kind of confusion of different views from what I've read of the breakdown already. So I personally don't think it's necessary.
Virginia Bottomley.
Well, I don't think it was a blessing in disguise at all. I think in many ways it was a vindication of what Douglas Hurd and John Major were fighting for so hard when they went through those negotiations at Maastricht. Because the whole point about intergovernment cooperation, not using the Brussels bureaucracy, but working together very closely as the member states. The whole question of subsidiarity, an ugly word, but a very important concept of saying we want to do things at the national level wherever possible. The whole point about strengthening up on the implementation of directives, because it is well known we tend to be rather rigorous in this country about the implementation of directives once that we've signed up. And I think that cautious, rigorous approach that John Major and Douglas Hurd showed was very important. And the interesting thing about all of our discussions about the European community is the way in which in this country Parliament is very important indeed. And after every summit, the Prime Minister comes back and for an hour will be answering questions in the House of Commons on anything to do with the summit, and the same for the other key ministers. And that's something that's striking about our Parliament rather than any others. So that I think, in a way, our position's been vindicated. I think we've got to take stock. I think that the Maastricht Treaty is right and is important, and I think we should move forward on it. I'm not a supporter of a referendum because I don't think it's really part of our constitution. I think we are a parliamentary democracy and it's for Parliament to decide. I think it's very difficult to reduce questions to a simple yes-no issue anyway. I think most matters are rather more complex than that. And I don't really understand what happens when a referendum produces one result and the House of Commons produces another. On Maastricht, we've debated it 3 times now at length, and the last time the bill got a 244 majority in the House of Commons. That's pretty good for my money.
Despite your endorsement of the treaty, would you accept that the Danes have killed it if they can't be persuaded to change their minds?
Well, as Douglas Hurd said, you know, a lot of the European community matters have progressed by means of hiccups along the way, and this is certainly quite a big hiccup. We've got to take stock, we've got to look and see what the way forward is. I certainly don't think it's been killed, but I think we've all got to do a bit more reflection.
Legally, technically, well, it's dead unless if one member doesn't endorse it.
Indeed, but we don't yet know how Denmark are going to take it forward. We don't yet know what the outcome is going to be, but I'm sure we do need to take stock, and I certainly think that what we secured at Maastricht are exactly the sort of issues that people are actually describing. A resentment against a great concentration of power, a resentment against bureaucrats who are not accountable and not answerable, a resentment against uncontrolled spending of public money without it being answerable to an elected parliament. So I think we've got so much to hold on to there. I think it's very early days yet to see how we can take it forward, but I'm confident that we will find a way through.
Sheila Lawlor.
Is it a blessing in disguise? Well, I think it's an enormous relief that the momentum of, if you like, federalist tendency or centralizing tendencies has been halted, if not forever, at least to give pause to think. And I'm very heartened by the reaction in the House of Commons of the 70 Conservative MPs who urged the Prime Minister to take the opportunity for a fresh start and put the emphasis to use his presidency, as he has declared so often he wants, for a wider Europe, not a deeper one, a wider one, and with the emphasis on the economic side of the treaties.
Why should he take any notice of these 70 Tory MPs if the Labour Party are prepared to back Maastricht, and the Liberals certainly are?
Because I think that John Major, certainly what he brought back from Maastricht and what he represented as a triumph was what he managed to get out of Maastricht, i.e. the anti-centralist, anti-federalist part of the treaty, the opt-out clause on the social charter, and the fact that Britain was not irrevocably committed to economic union. Now, these are the things that Mr. Major is proud of, and rightly so. The Labour Party is not in favour of that sort of policy, but what I would say, why it is important is that the younger MPs, many of them who have just gone into the House of Commons, who have joined forces with the older ones, they...
yes, 25 of the 70
yes.
are new, new MPs.
And, you know, they are strengthening the hand of somebody whose commitment has already been made clear in that direction. So I think it's not why should he listen to them, but why should he not be encouraged to follow his own head? So I think that's rather important.
Marie Stewart.
Blessing in disguise. I suppose you could say that in the sense that maybe it gives an opportunity to take stock. Because one of the things that struck me about a lot of the discussions about Europe is that there is no shared vision about the sort of Europe that we're trying to create and the sort of links that we're trying to create. The point about the Danish vote is that it isn't a unified position. Some people want closer links, it said some people want a less centralization. And I think that there is certainly the need to discuss the sort of Europe that we're trying to create. I think greater union is inevitable, but maybe it gives an opportunity for us to stop and think through what we're trying to achieve before we try to set up the structures and the mechanisms.
Well, we'll
I was
want to
just
come
going
back.
to say, you can't but help listening to Sheila and Virginia see exactly the problem that John Major's in. Because we have Sheila saying, oh, well, it gives him a chance to review the whole thing and we can go back to basics and start again. Here's 70 MPs want to renegotiate the whole thing. And Virginia repeating Douglas's comment, there's just a bit of a hiccup and all we have to do is go forward and it'll all be all right. I mean, it shows exactly the problem that he's facing within his own party. I don't think it's as simple, though, Virginia, just to say that it's a hiccup and that you will find a way forward in the future and all you've got to do is just keep going and eventually you'll make it there. I was a bit worried tonight when Douglas came back and said, you know, we'll forge on and get there in the end, because in a sense there are 61 parts of the treaty talking about qualified majorities, which will have to change, half a dozen references to Denmark. There's a lot there that's got to shift, and there was a bit too much kind of, oh, well, we'll manage it, a bit too kind of self-sufficient and it'll all be okay.
I'll come back to you in a minute. Let's hear from our questioner, Mr. Shah.
Yes, I agree with Sheila, Lawlor and Marie Stewart. I think the signal that's come out of Denmark is that we have been going ahead with the idea of Europe with indecent haste, and that a brake has to be applied, and people have to take stock, and we have to review where we stand. And clearly, the referendum, which is yet to come in France and Ireland, may also bring out the same sort of feeling.
Thank you very much. Let me put this specific point to Virginia Bottomley. You talk of getting the thing back on the rails, but what formula is there to put it back on the rails? If the Treaty of Rome can only be amended by unanimous agreement and the Danes say no, how can Maastricht be resurrected? What possible formula is there?
We don't yet know, though, how the Danes can go forward and whether any special provision can be made for them, which obviously would have to be meet
A
with
repeat
unanimity.
of the British opt-out position.
It's really too early to say, and I don't want to be forced into making all sorts of comments, which I'm in no position to make on it. But I think there is far more of a common view about this, because the whole point about what was being achieved at Maastricht was exactly that we should go ahead with cooperation without it going through Brussels, without it going through the European Court. The whole questions of the interior and the justice aspect should go ahead separately, out of the power of Brussels. And it's exactly those anxieties about the domination of a centralist, bureaucratic, unaccountable force, which actually we were seeking to address for the first time. And the Maastricht Treaty is a move back in that direction from the Single European Act. We may not have conveyed that clearly and as forcefully as we should, but that is the reality of the situation, and that in a way is what Mrs. Thatcher was always articulating so forcefully, because what I was seeking to show was that in our particular system, inevitably government has to be that much closer to the elected representatives because of the rigorous grilling we give our ministers in our House of Commons every time they return from a community meeting.
Thank you. I'll take a few from the audience now. That lady there.
I think that the result of this referendum really brings into very, very sharp focus the question of national sovereignty, because in 1972 the Danes voted for the Treaty of Accession. Now, as is their constitutional right, they have voted against monetary and economic union. I think the Danish people are saying very clearly that they want the final say on the future of their country, not Brussels bureaucrats. And I think we've got to do some very serious renegotiation.
Gentleman there.
Reports coming out of Denmark indicate that the reason why for the no decision, which was a very small majority, is there is a great fear of Germany in Denmark. And that was the reason why I thought that Germany was sort of rule over the rest of the EEC.
Well, a poll released today shows 81% of the sample, 3,500 Germans surveyed, wanted Bonn to call a referendum over whether to give up the mark for a common European currency. So it's very much alive, the debate in Germany as well. That gentleman there.
Simon, it's true that's what someone said earlier about we are a parliamentary democracy, but the whole point is that we vote for our government to act on our behalf. When, as we're going through now, there's such a massive dilution in their power structure. I think they should just go to a national referendum, and we're actually changing the structure of our government, which we vote for.
Thank you. Gentleman in the stripes.
Yes, what concerns me about this issue is that we've heard today that the Danes are being told either sign up or get out. Now, would this be the same case if this were Germany that had voted no, or France that's coming up soon?
Well, surely the point is that you can't say that to the Danes, can you? That there is no way they can be expelled from the European community because they're signatories to the original Treaty of Rome. All that can happen is that this extra step forward cannot take place. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that, you know, I have been very, very amused at the reactions from right around Europe, including the reaction of Monsieur Lawlor. The idea that if the Danes don't do what they're told, they are the naughty people in the class, and somehow or another endless referenda will take place until such time as they do as they're expected to and come in. Well, it's complete, you know, when you think of what in fact is happening, serious constitutional change for absolutely every country in Europe, and that this should be taken, I'm afraid to say, at the diktat of Monsieur Lawlor and his co-federalists in Europe. It isn't on. And remember, you know, John Major means very well, and I think there is a great deal of agreement on the Conservative side about that Europe should be wide, it should stress economic freedom, the way to prosperity and to unity in the future, if that's what we want, is through economic agreement and free trade. It is not about getting rid of parliaments and sovereignty and getting rid of independent constitutional rights in order to give more power to bureaucracies. We've done enough of that in this country, and we're only getting out of that mess now.
But there are enough federalists on the Tory side. Can the Tory party remain intact over the next few months?
I think that if you are looking for federalists, you don't have to look further than any socialist in Europe. And Monsieur Lawlor is the right-hand man of Monsieur Mitterrand, and they are both socialists. And this debate has now been going on in France for a little while. Conservatives with a small c, not extremely right-wing conservatives, but ordinary conservative people, regard Monsieur Lawlor as simply a socialist federalist who wants to draw a blueprint for Europe and make everybody else fitted. National sovereignty is at stake.
I put the same question to Mowlam. A lot of people believe that Labour's divisions are equally as deep as the government's, but they were well concealed in the run-up to the election. Can the Labour Party maintain solidarity over Europe?
No, clearly there were differences in our party, quite readily admitted, but not, as I made the point earlier, as large as the Conservatives. And the difference is, the point that Sheila's making, you can't just kind of label Delors as the bad man of Europe and he's the one that's created all the problems. That is a very simplistic, if I might say, a view of the situation. Yes, in response to the question from the woman there, it's about national sovereignty, and that is terribly important. And we want to keep that decentralisation of power. We also, and I disagree with you fundamentally there, Sheila, when you talk it's about free trade and just about economic markets and free markets. Yes, but then you'll get a Europe of bankers with absolutely no management by national governments as to what's going on, which is why we in the Labour Party supported, like most of the other countries, the social chapter, so at least we had the same basic rights as other Europeans, and that is an important difference. I don't want a Europe run by bankers, the kind of model that you're putting in any way at all.
But Peter, not only...
Brief word, and then I'll move on.
Not only are the Labour Party deeply divided, and far more widely divided than the Conservative Party on this, better than that, they've changed their tune 6 or 7 times as whether they're for Europe or against Europe in the last 10 years. So they don't even agree amongst themselves from year on year
Must
on
be a
where they
relief
stand on
that
Europe.
Margaret Thatcher isn't in the House of Commons at the moment.
She signed up to the Single European Act. We followed her. She was the one who talked about enlargement. It was really her who kept talking, wasn't it, about Poland, about Czechoslovakia, about Hungary. And that's where John Major was last week. She really identified that very clearly, and that's very consistent with where we are now.
Mowlam asks me if I would ask the audience if they would care for a referendum. I have a feeling that I know what the answer will be, but it may be of interest to our viewers at home to see. Hands up those who would wish to vote on this issue of the Maastricht Treaty in a referendum. And hands down and hands up those who feel a referendum is unnecessary. I think it's about as narrow as the Danish vote, isn't it?
Exactly.
But probably the referendites have it.
Just like that woman on the radio from the French this morning that said the only trouble with the French in a referendum is they never answer the question, which I thought was lovely.
Let's move on. Let's take another question from Mr. Chalel Murukasan, who is a local government officer. Mr. Murukasan.
Yeah.
There he is.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Is it, the question is to Virginia Bottomley, is it such a bad situation that our NHS operates to push the 4-year-old Laura Davis to USA to have her liver bowl operation done? Then what happened to your promises made on NHS before the election?
Mr. Murukasan asking about 4-year-old Laura Davis, who's gone to the United States. Why couldn't she have her operation here on the National Health Service?
Well, I think you know that in fact what Laura Davis needed was a liver and bowel transplant, a very experimental and a very new form of treatment. And it's very difficult, as every day you read in the papers about new and experimental, often highly dangerous, very costly new techniques. And that's the explosion on the health budget, inevitably. All these new techniques that could never have been thought possible a generation ago. And in fact, that she then came and was seen by Sir Roy Khan, a leading liver specialist at Addenbrooke's. And she was offered to have that operation at Addenbrooke's in Cambridge. And indeed that the specialist should come over and supervise or do the operation at Addenbrooke's. And indeed the special new drug that stops the rejection of the new organs was brought in especially for the operation.
And who would have paid for all that?
In the NHS, provided by the NHS at Addenbrooke's in Cambridge by Sir Roy Khan,
and
a very great
and to bring the
eminent
foreign
specialist.
surgeon in?
Indeed, that was the commitment. It's not something that, obviously, as the health service, you would rubber stamp that sort of commitment to bring a specialist in for a particular operation. But it's something that you can do in special circumstances. In that case, the parents had a terribly difficult decision. Were they going to have the operation done here, where if there are difficulties, then you've got the doctor who did the operation on hand in the country, or was she to go to the States? And they took the view in the end that she should go to Pittsburgh and go to the States. But you know, for the most part, that's a very unusual story, because one of the things that we have in this country is a very remarkable NHS, and on the whole, the balance is more likely for people coming from all around the world to want to have their operations here, because we have the most remarkable number of specialists undertaking pioneering treatment. There's a very difficult issue for all of us in the health service, because every day we want to do more for those with learning disabilities, for the mentally ill, for care in the community, and you always have to balance between those routine, unexciting operations, techniques, treatments, don't get the headlines, but actually improve the quality of people's lives. You balance that against some of this amazing frontier of science, highly costly new techniques, so that we can now keep alive infants and people who we could never have thought possible in the past. A very difficult judgment.
Marie Stewart.
I too will start with acknowledging the difficult choice that those parents had to make, because they had a choice of having the surgery done here, but with a less experienced team, or going to the States, to a situation that would be very unsettling, but where the team had a very good record with similar surgery. I think as a question about the quality of service from the NHS, the point about the NHS is that it actually suits you to have some rare exotic illness if you want the good treatment, because then you'll get it. It's if you have a bad hip or you have something that isn't life-threatening, and then you've got to sit around and wait. And, you know, I know you're going to say about juggling waiting lists, but, you know, that's the problem. It's the routine, non-life-threatening, but very inconvenient conditions where people get a bad deal at the moment. And that's where lack of resources and issues like that come to the point.
But as a general principle, do you think that the National Health Service should be committed to financing the most experimental, albeit life-saving operations at vast expense, when the hundreds of thousands of pounds involved might routinely treat lots more people with great suffering, but who are cost a lot less money to treat?
Yes, I mean, that's a discussion that's a choice that's often presented, but it isn't like that. It isn't that simple, because the whole point is if you don't do the pioneering, expensive early research, you don't move healthcare forward. And I'd like to make another point on the question of costs. When we hear the horrendous costs of healthcare in the United States, I'd like to know what the comparable cost in the UK for that operation would have been, because one of the things about the National Health Service is that it's extremely cost effective. Once you start to go to the private system, the sort of situation where you've got to have a big administration to count, you know, how many needles and how many tablets you've had, because everything's got to be charged back. The bureaucracy in the private health service in the United States makes healthcare extraordinarily expensive. So that's another point about that situation.
Sheila Lawlor.
I think it's a very interesting question because it raises, I suppose, what is the most serious problem affecting the NHS. Healthcare is becoming increasingly expensive with every new operation which is discovered, every new course of treatment. It becomes very, very expensive. At the same time, we are having an increasingly aging population to support and a smaller tax base to support it. So within 20 or 30 years, we will have fewer people paying taxes, we will have more people to look after, and we will have much more expensive medicine. And I think that sometime, some government is going to have to ask the question, how do we get more money into the NHS without killing off the taxpayer? And I think one way it will have to do it is encourage, not force, but encourage people who wish to use their money to pay for private medicine to do so. I think there should be an NHS for anybody who wants it or needs it, but I think the only honest thing to do to save good health care for the future when we have fewer taxpayers and we have far more demands on the public purse is to go about encouraging people to spend their money if they want to spend it. I can't tell you how hard it is to spend money on medicine. I don't have a motor car. I would like to spend money on medicine. Do you think it's possible for me to find a GP anywhere whom I could pay?
But if the health service is as good as Virginia Bottomley, if the health service is as good as Virginia Bottomley says she wants to make it, you won't persuade anyone to spend their money taking an inferior service.
It's not a question of good or bad service, it's a matter of principle. If you want to get as much money as possible for the people who need it, for people who are sick, for people who are old, for people who need emergency treatment and expensive treatment, you've got to encourage more money in the future. I'm not talking about today or tomorrow. Medicine is as expensive as everything else. It's like a telephone number. You can keep dialing. Now, I don't know what the Labour Party's answer is, but I presume it's more taxation.
We can hear.
But but it is a very interesting problem because the other part of the problem, if I'll just say it very quickly, the other part of the problem is how do you introduce more direct relationships between patient and doctor, between patient and hospital, so that it is the patient and doctor or the patient and hospital which reaches the decision and not the NHS, if you like, the remote body. And that is really at the heart of this question, and it's a very problematic one, but that is another direction in which I think healthcare will have to move, more direct relations.
Mowlam.
Let me begin by just picking up on Sheila's last point. Yes, of course, healthcare costs, and it will continue to cost as people live longer. and the ageing population and medical breakthroughs, all those are genuine problems. But then let's don't kid ourselves when Virginia talks, and she talks about helping people in community care and helping people with learning disabilities. The state of community care and the amount of government money that has gone in is absolutely obscene. So let's acknowledge that we have a problem with an ageing population, but let's pretend that in any way the present government is dealing with them, because they are not. You say it's just a question of killing off the taxpayer and that's the only way of raising money. Well, my goodness, when there was tax cuts given by the way that the government dealt last time was to actually give tax money back to people rather than actually saying, here is something that we can invest in. Because the problem is very well put by Marie, that unless you invest in it and then we get the kind of breakthrough in science that is needed, we won't deal with the day-to-day medical problems that thousands of people are faced with. So that has to be done alongside. Yes, it's a problem that governments are going to have to face. It's like Rio. It's a long-term problem that we've really got to come to terms with. But the present government is creating a facade to pretend in any way that they're dealing with it. Can I just say one other thing? Because Virginia said at the beginning about that of course they would pay for little Laura Davises on the NHS and that the parents had a difficult choice. All that I accept. But what I would like to hear from her then is that if she was going to pay for this child, do other children, as we see them in the papers now, having the parents having to kind of use their children as a lottery to get media and tabloid coverage to get the money for their children, which is the only way they can do it. Are you going to make that commitment to other children, or just because that one hit the headlines, is that the one you're going
There
for?
is another child.
There's another child,
There's two-year-old Stewart Masters, whose appeal has so far, according to this cutting in the Sunday Express, has so far reached just £24,000 of the £190,000 he desperately needs for the same operation as little Laura. What should his parents do?
The aspect of the Labour Party approach to health that I most despise is constantly taking individual cases who are then discussed in public, breaking all privacy and all confidentiality about their own particular circumstances. Because the difficulty is there will often be parents who think they have found an operation or a treatment in another part of the world that may or may not be the one that is most advised by the specialist here in this country. And it's a very difficult, it's a very emotional matter. Because of course when parents think there is some great opportunity in somewhere else in the world, their hopes are raised. But I can give an assurance that that particular child I know is getting the best possible advice, and I happen to take the view that our health service is indeed the envy of the world, and our specialists are amongst the most eminent and the most distinguished. And I can personally conceive of no circumstances where any member of my family was seriously ill, I would think that I could go somewhere else for better treatment than the treatment that I could get in this country. But that doesn't, that does not undermine the difficult decision that has always been the case in health. The first time you had one intensive baby care cot, a choice had to be made as to who would use it. When you had one kidney transplant unit, you had to decide who would use it. When you had the first heart transplants, you had to decide who was going to use it. And the balance that I feel so strongly, which is exactly the one that Marie touched on, is that my judgment as a health secretary must always be to want to push ahead with the scientific, pioneering, innovative, but not to lose sight of those very large numbers of people who are not at the exotic end, but where money goes a very long way at improving their quality of life. That isn't a new judgment. That isn't a new judgment. That is something that's as old as the health service. And just before I hear any more from Mo, I just have to remind you that the time when I worked in the health service was the time when, because the economy got so totally out of control, the Labour government cut nurses' pay, cut the building programme, cut doctors' pay, cut the health service.
But
I want to do more, and I want to go further. But there are very difficult choices to be made.
Just to go back to the question, if Labour had won the election on April the 9th, would the plight of these two children looking for this expensive experimental surgery be any different?
At the short term, no, of course not. But I mean, the point I'm pointing out is I'm acknowledging the long-term problems very openly. But on the short term, what I'm saying is if you let money decide and the market decide, which is what in the end is operating, then you will get these decisions, unless you have a rational decision-making structure. It's very interesting what you did in the past, Virginia, but you're now the minister responsible for it. And what we want to know is the distinctions that you will make between the exact cases that Marie talks about and these children who are being auctioned in the papers, and that is not acceptable.
And I'm committed to a national health service service available to all and free at the point of delivery.
Well, it's
and
not
that's
there.
what we have, and that's what we
Not
will
what we have.
continue to have. And any suggestion of anything other is mischievous.
Mr. Murakusan asked the question specifically about Laura Davis. You have the last word on that. Are you happy about the answer you got
No,
from
I'm
the
not
Secretary
very
of State?
convinced what our health secretary said, because national health should be available free to all. And if the nation doesn't have the money to invest on research, it is very sad.
Well, I'll come back doubtless to Virginia Bottomley. Let's hear some more from you. Gentleman there.
Yes, to Virginia Bottomley, she's harking back to what Labour would or didn't do. They've been there 14 years. Yeah. And at the present moment, there are 38,000 nurses still waiting since 1988 for their wages settlements. And in the last 5 years, there are now 18,000 more administrators than there were 5 years ago. And
yes.
this is the change that the Tories have made. They want to destroy a public health service.
I'll come back to Virginia Bottomley in a moment. Gentleman there.
Surely with this medical science getting more and more high-tech, it's sensible if one particular country does one particular bit of research, another country does another bit, instead of duplicating it, triplicating it, quadruplicating it.
Yeah, fine. Let's hear from you about, just how deep should the NHS pockets be for this expensive, high-tech experimental surgery? Gentleman at the back.
I'm quite shocked that the only solution you seem to see to illness is to throw medicine and science at it, as if illness was at the same level all the time. The greatest cause of ill health in this country is poverty, and you should be looking at reducing poverty as any health policy.
Thank you. Gentleman over there. Yes.
I'd just like to ask Ms. Bottomley, if the NHS is so worldwide envied, why the staff in the NHS are so badly the morale in the NHS?
Well, everyone wants to talk to the Secretary of State for Health on these, but can you be very brief, because I'd like to make a bit more progress.
Very briefly, if I may, the nurses are dramatically much better paid than they were, approaching 50% increase in their pay. What you're talking about is the appeals on the regrading, which is because the union wouldn't agree to change the rules on which you went through the appeals processes. We've got to bring an end to it, and we're looking for a way through that. But nobody should underestimate the 50% better pay that nurses have. That isn't their prime concern at the moment. As far as the research goes, what I should say, of course, is that we very much hope that it will be possible to have a centre that provides exactly that treatment. The Chief Medical Officer at the moment is talking with a group of doctors to see how we can introduce that technique as well in this particular country. The poverty point, what I think is very important is what one of the other distinguishing factors of our health service is the concentration on primary care, on the family doctor service, which has expanded beyond all recognition. And on your particular point, sir, one of the things we introduced that I'm particularly proud of is that we for the first time have deprivation payments for the GPs who work in the inner city areas. We never had that in the past, which means there's an extra incentive to go to the areas where, of course, people need the basic encouragement to come forward and receive health care.
I'll take a couple more brief points. That lady in yellow.
I have a daughter that's a nurse, and she's very well motivated and really enjoys nursing, and she's very well paid.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back with the beard.
Yes, I feel that it's the media who is at fault here. They are the ones who seem to decide who shall get the surgery and who shall not get the surgery, and I think that it should be left up to the health service.
Thank you very much. Media getting blamed for yet one more thing in the mighty catalogue. Let's take another question from Sue Hames, who's an office clerk.
Good evening.
There.
Does the panel think politicians will ever put the long-term needs of the planet before their short-term need to be re-elected?
Marie Stewart. I wonder who it was who decided to hold the Rio summit 5 months before the American presidential election.
Because this is what's so depressing. When you see American politicians and their representatives justifying and defending American patterns of consumption, when they're at an Earth conference where we're trying to talk about sustainable development, we're trying to talk about the damage that's already been done to the environment and to the planet, it makes you really wonder whether there is any hope. And you see, in all the directions, we're getting the same sorts of situations, because what we also have is that there are real problems that have been identified. The rainforest needs to be preserved. But then you have at the other side these countries where the politicians represent people that walk everywhere, that carry everything on their heads. And they're expected to tell their population, well, actually, we can't have this development because all the people that have been driving in Denver have put out so much exhaust that, you know, we're going to have a bigger hole in the ozone layer. So at the other end, for example, we hear Dr. Matahir in Malaysia talking about the fact that it's his rainforest and he's got to log it because he's got to have development in his country so that he can have all the cars and all the big buildings that we have in the developed world. But we've got to get together, haven't we? I mean, we really have to recognize that, first of all, the present situation has a history, so it's unrealistic for some of the countries that have high levels of development, have high patterns of consumption, to tell people that don't, that they should correct the damage that's already been done. But there is the need for cooperation, and here we come again, you know, for money to be spent. And probably the people that have the highest levels of development, that have done most of the consumption and the pollution, are actually going to have to pay.
Sheila Lawlor.
I don't know why we blame the politicians. I would say it's individuals, it's people themselves who have to think about these things. You can't just put all the blame on politicians and say, well, you know, they're not doing enough. It begins at home, like charity. I've already boasted about not having a car, so I can't do that. But if you are sensible and conserve and do not waste and squander, as people tend to waste and squander, that is a very big start. I mean, we can start at home, in our own families and at home. I really can't think that it's for the government to stop making rules and inventing bureaucracies to supervise the rules. It's for each and every one of us
But what about what President Bush said? He said, we cannot permit the extreme in the environmental movement to shut down the United States. We cannot shut down the lives of many Americans by going to the extreme on the environment. That's a politician speaking. That's not that's a political statement designed to try to ensure his re-election.
I think you behind your question and behind the question as I understood it from the lady in the audience is the idea that governments can and should do something about it. There are certain things government should do, and as we all know, we have the greatest environmental problems in the poorest countries. In Eastern Europe, you didn't need to see the Eastern European countries dissolve to realize that the kind of problems they have had ecologically in the East were due to poverty, collectivism, and over-bureaucratized society. Here in the West, as you know, any kind of environmental care and ecological care comes with prosperity. And it is a fact of life that one really has to be well off in order to pay for ecology, in order to pay for clean air and prosperity. It isn't for richer nations to lecture poorer nations about how they should proceed. But what is the role of government here? It is to promote the kind of prosperous society where people can afford to pay for clean air, for a clean environment, and can afford to take the measures which will help them. Not lectures, but prosperity, trade, not aid.
But how do you get the prosperity if we're saying that they can't do some of the things that they see as the route to prosperity in their countries?
Well, exactly. This is why I say I do not think it is for government to lecture them. I think that they will have to take whatever steps they have to take to become prosperous. And I think this is a matter, for instance...
Cutting down the rainforest so that they can have agriculture. Isn't that the problem?
They're taking the steps which they believe will make them prosperous, but they're damaging the environment.
They can't do anything else. What else can they do? What other industries?
I think that we have, you know, I think there's a great deal to be said for open government and free trade. And I think for a start...
I agree with you on that. A major problem
right.
and a major reason for some of the development projects and the damage that's being done in some of the poorer countries is the poor terms of trade that happens internationally for the raw materials that
we sell. And so the question becomes, Sheila,
briefly.
Well, let's have whether you can from your kitchen. Yes, you ought to be more ecologically sound, but can you renegotiate the Uruguay GATT agreement and the third world debt from your kitchen? Is it not something for politicians? Surely government have a role. That is a government job, surely.
I think that if you are talking about the role which individuals make, and if it's the role of government to reflect what individuals want to do, I don't think it behoves the Labour Party or anybody else to tell people what they can and can't do. But really, on the point of trade, let us take the case of a Fortress Europe. If we have a closed EEC, which puts up a tariff barrier against outside countries and makes it impossible for poorer countries to get a fair deal on an open market, well, that is something which we might think about. There are all kinds of things at the level of trading.
I'm with you, Sheila. I'm with you on looking at GATT. I'm with you on renegotiating. I'm with you on looking at third world debt. But I think in answer directly to the question, I think politicians do look short term. I think we are bad.
And what's the answer to that?
I think we are conditioned by the 5-year election cycle, and I think there are certain things that we ought to perhaps take out of that and say these are long-term goals that ought not to become political footballs. But the effort to do that has to be much bigger than any of us are playing with now, because Rio is looking at, the biodiversity and the climate thing. And one level, Sheila's right. It is about cancelling third world debt in the long term. It is about renegotiating trade. It is actually about fundamentally looking at and managing the present difficulty before we have to manage it in a crisis. And we will, in your lifetime, have to do that unless we can, as politicians in one country or across countries, begin to handle that. And it won't now the West-East divide has gone. It will be the North-South divide unless we begin to act, not just morally, because it's not just a question of a moral response to the problems in the third world, because after all, we created a lot of them. Come on, let's be straight. But in addition, it will actually help us if we begin to behave sensibly in relation to the third world. And so your question is absolutely apposite. We are all bad at it.
Well, do you know any politicians who put the long-term needs of the planet before their short-term needs to be re-elected?
Well, I think the way through is
Yourself
the work.
included.
I think the way through is the work of all those voluntary organisations and the NGOs. Because the point about the Green Movement, the point about Friends of the Earth, the point about all the other lobbying groups which do particularly powerful work in this country is they force the politicians to make them realise that environmental issues aren't only important for the planet, they are important for their electoral chances. Remember when the Greens here got 15% in the Euro elections? And I think that's one of the ways in which they make politicians of all parties say these are issues that must be confronted. But actually, I don't share the sort of slightly cynical view about what's happening in Rio. Because I think to have over 100 heads of state, 160 nations gathered together, I believe once you've got them there, then you'll get them to sign, and then you'll get them to take it forward. In this very conference, we had the Saving the Ozone, in this very room, we had the Saving the Ozone conference. And the fact is we are going to be eliminating the CFCs, and we in this country then gave money into the third world to help them develop the alternatives to CFCs. I think it's very important for the United States to go to Rio. If they produce 23% of the carbon dioxide, for goodness sake, they need to be there. And then once they're in the process, they can take it forward and do better. And I think it's very important, the work that's been done in terms of writing off debt, improving trade, and above all, please, encouraging the development of population policies to enable people who want to control their family size to have access to that as well. I think the Rio is a great opportunity. Of course people can be cynical, but you've got them there. They're having a media bean feast. Goodness knows how many there are in Rio, but that brings it into everybody's sitting room, and once it's in everybody's sitting room, they're going to be leaning on their own politicians. I bet, Mo, you've had a lot of letters from your constituents about it. I certainly have. And that's a way of getting at us and making us feel that the electoral issues and the global issues are actually self-reinforcing.
But the message to President Bush from his farmers in the Midwest isn't cave in at Rio, it's get these environmentalists off our backs.
That's these farmers, but there are other people in the United States. If he goes, and we've been instrumental in encouraging him to be there, he could have stayed at home.
Do you include him among the cynical people that you mentioned?
I would not make any such comment at all.
But if that's the response,
the point
Virginia,
is, if he
if that's
is
the
producing
response, Virginia,
23%
where is the
of
environment
CO2?
bill in the government's new legislation? Where's energy efficiency? Where's renewable energy sources? If you're so responsive and you're acting so well, it's not in the government legislation now.
Well,
is it?
what we've got, isn't it, is we're eliminating the CFCs.
By the
Just
year
agreed to
2000,
we just agreed to
unobligatory.
bring down the target for the CO2 emissions. We've got a great number of initiatives through the aid programme, a great number of forestry initiatives. I think the world is changing very fast.
Let's hear from the lady. Let's hear from the lady who asked the question, Sue Hames. Sue Hames, what do you think?
Well,
You really set the cat among the pigeons there.
I just feel that to make any real big difference, it's going to cost us all money, and we're going to have to change our way of life. And it's probably going to take some sort of legislation to make us do that. And I just don't know if there's a politician that would risk it.
Right, let's hear the lady in the pink there. Yes.
Can I just ask the panel, Mrs. Bottomley started the conversation by saying ecology begins at home, like charity. How many of the panel actually... You did, sorry. How many of the panel actually used the bottle banks and tin can banks and dispose of their...
Yes, are you all good ecologists?
We're bottle bank. You're bottle bank.
Newspapers, cardboard?
Bottle bank.
There you are.
Bicycles too? I do in my constituency where it's easy. I'm not so good in London where it's more difficult. I'm truthful at least.
Right, there's your answer. Gentleman there. Yes.
I'm surprised that the government minister suggested that it needs voluntary organisations to get the government moving, you know, to act, because surely they should have acted in the first place, you know, after they've been elected for 14 years.
Right, and that gentleman there.
Virginia Bottomley mentions overpopulation. Surely what we need in this extremely overcrowded island is a legal limit on family size, so that we can lead the rest of the world in solving what is certainly the central problem.
How would you enforce this legal limit?
The same way as everything else.
Arrest people, send them to jail?
Yes, absolutely.
The lady up there with the grey hair.
I'd like to see those 100 leaders talking in the same way as they are about the rainforest, talking about the children that we see in Chile and in the South American countries.
Thank you.
They can't see the children. You know, they've removed the children from the streets so that the people that in Rio won't be able to see poor people and they won't see the children.
Okay, well, we've got about 8 minutes left, and there's an important question here, in which we had a number of people ask in various forms. This is from David Hall, who is a management consultant. Sir.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Which job in the civil service does the panel think would most benefit from being privatised?
Well, I think this is a reference to William Waldegrave, Virginia's old boss, who's now in charge of the civil service, that the winds of privatisation would soon be whistling through Whitehall. Mowlam.
I think I'd probably either go for Inland Revenue, Customs and Excise, because I don't necessarily think privatisation leads to greater efficiency, but the Inland Revenue couldn't be any more inefficient than it is now, or probably for the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, because I think that would probably give him a push.
But you are, in principle, of an element of privatisation of the...
No, I'm accepting it that in the goodwill of David Hall's question, that if I had to choose, that's what I'd go for, but I'm not convinced that privatisation in itself improves the quality. It's not actually who owns it, to my mind, or who runs it, which is terribly important. What I want is a quality service, not just the Waldegrave kind of waffle, if I can be so crude, but what I want is actually regulation or some mechanism of control that it will actually be implemented. And that is the weakness that we've seen with the BR, with the water, with the Alecki privatisation, that it all looks wonderful on paper, but if you don't enforce it and you don't enforce investment in energy efficient forces, which they could have done, then we would have had a better environment nationally where we could start. So that's how I would respond.
Thank you. Now, unless I'm mistaken, Virginia Bottomley is the biggest employer in Western Europe. But she says she has no plans to privatise the health service. But do you have civil service targets for privatisation?
I think the issue is to try to look with any great bureaucracy, which are the tasks that can actually be provided by competitive tendering, by privatising them, because what you're doing is specifying the outcomes. It actually meets Mo's point, is what is it we're trying to achieve? What are the goals, as opposed to simply trying to think of one's own organisation? because the process of any big monolithic, monopolistic bureaucracy is in the end to become terribly self-seeking and self-serving, not intentionally, but to forget what are the aims and the objectives. And why I'm such a supporter of the whole concept of the Citizens' Charter, of the work going on in the public services, is to say that public service is an important and a valuable role. How it's achieved, the mechanisms for achieving it, require new thought and new energy and new concentration. And there are all sorts of areas where it's possible to privatise the work, whether it's the information technology, whether it's some of the professional skills. But in the past, we've talked rather often about the blue-collar jobs, although they're the ones where you should go for competitive tendering. Why not move into the white-collar jobs, the professional services? But that means the task of the public service is to specify what it is we're wanting for whom, and to make sure that service is properly accountable and to make sure it's reaching those proper standards. And I think this is very exciting and very important and will mean that those of us who use the services will stand to benefit, and those of us who are paying for the service can also be sure that we get good value for money.
Is there any natural exemption, anything you think of that would be unthinkable in the civil service to privatise?
Well, I'm a slightly old-fashioned
Policy
person.
analysis?
Indeed. I think that I do think in this country that we do have a civil service who is genuinely independent, who genuinely will work for whichever is the government of the day, and who are there at the centre formulating policy. And I think there is a core civil service function which I believe should stay and should remain, and I wouldn't want to lose that, because I think actually it's part of our tradition and part of our government structure.
Marie Stewart.
I've got to be careful, you see, because some of my best friends are civil servants, and I'm not sure that they would actually like this idea of applying for your own job. But seriously, thinking about the question, I have difficulty with the question, because I don't think, in a sense the way that Mo said, I don't think privatization or public sector is the issue. Believe me, I go around a range of companies and organizations in the public and private sector, and good management, or bad management for that matter, is not the prerogative of one particular area. You find it across the board. And it's good management, it's flexible management, it's efficient services, it's effective service delivery. That's what we need. And the issue isn't about whether it's private or not. There is some evidence that in some of the privatized services, it isn't an improvement because you get poor working conditions, you get horrendous conditions of work for some of the lower paid workers in some of the services that get contracted out, because the prime choice is based on cost rather than a more complex judgments. So I think I'll pass on making that choice. You know, I
Sheila
suppose
Lawlor
I have
pass
difficulty
on
with the
that.
question.
No, I suppose that one would, that any of the jobs which are done, which can be done by outsiders or indeed by insiders applying to do them, I think we should think about. I think there's no reason why a certain group of people should be sheltered from having to compete with others who might do the job as well and who might do it more cheaply. It's in the interest of the taxpayer, it's in the interest of the country.
What about confidentiality, impartiality, special expertise, that sort of thing?
I think that the civil service doesn't have a monopoly, as we discovered in the last few years, on being confidential. I don't think that is something we might think about. Impartiality, I think that's very important, but with many of the professions, and I think, say, with the legal profession or the medical professions, one doesn't expect them to breach confidentiality.
So
these are not qualities which are specific to the civil service. We can find them outside the civil service. If it is a case that a civil servant can do a job better, more confidentially, more cheaply than anybody else, that's absolutely fine. But we won't know until we open up the service and see.
Do you have any prime targets at the CPS? No? Right. Let's hear from our questioner, David Hall. Where is he? Yes.
I mean, I think the issue, I mean, in business, a bad management would get fired or the company taken over. One would question the performance of the Treasury in the last 5 years and wonder what has happened, how accountable are they, and have they all been changed as a result of the advice they've given the Conservative government over the last 5 years?
Thank you very much. Let's hear, we've got a minute left, let's try and fill it well. That gentleman there.
Yes, I wonder how far we need to go with the privatization, because, I mean, prisons were supposed to be privatized, and they're having a new security service. The civil servants, they have a duty to see if anywhere anything goes wrong. So I mean, there are numbers of reasons for some of the part of the civil servant shouldn't be privatized.
Right. Thank you very much. That gentleman there.
I was just thinking, woe betide us if the Inland Revenue ever became a profit-making organisation.
And that gentleman there.
I think we should privatise the Ministry of Agriculture and get rid of all these crazy subsidies that they have. Industry doesn't get subsidies like they do. Get rid of them and privatise it.
Thank you. And that unfortunately, I'm sorry, Mo, is all we have time for tonight. Next week, question time comes from Derby, when on the panel will be the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Paddy Ashdown, the Shadow Chancellor and Labour leadership contender John Smith, the local Tory MP, Edwina Curry, and Ian Hay Davison, chairman of Storehouse. Now, before we go, if any of you would like to be part of the Question Time audience in the new series starting in September, for a number of editions which come from London, here's the number to phone, 071 284 4000. Next series, London, September onwards, 071 284 4000. We'll then send you a questionnaire from which, when you send them back, we can begin making up the representative sample of the British public for those programmes. So until next Thursday at 10 past 10 on BBC1, thank you for watching, and to you all, a very good night.
On BBC2 in 15 minutes, The Late Show goes behind the scenes of this year's Kathleen Ferrier Awards and follows the 10 finalists from their arrival at the event to their final performance.
Hello.
It's Rory Bremner.
The cool, sexy one. All right. Yes, indeed.
Tomorrow at 9 on BBC2.
Stand me, you're right. Ah!
Denmark, last-minute challenges for the European Football Championship. England, in search of lasting glory. Live coverage on BBC1 next Thursday at 7.
Well, as you probably know, due to the rain, there's been no play at Edgbaston today. So in place of the highlights here on 1 in 45 minutes, there's a chance to see England and Pakistan playing at the same ground in 1987, in the third one-day international, which produced some of the most spectacular cricket seen in recent years. First, Ethan puts his life on the line as he helps to reunite an orphaned brother and sister.